Confidence is high. I guess we've begun. Thanks everybody for being here. It's really a pleasure. I know, on a Friday afternoon, deep in November, with the holidays looming and studio deadlines, I'm sure you've got nothing other to be doing this afternoon than to spend an hour and a half or so with us here. But I want to say thanks for turning out. There are more chairs coming. And I would also say, in terms of format, we try to keep this space. Were they full clothes? I don't always think of the GSD community as necessarily athletic. Present company excluded. You look fabulous, but I would say. So we have more chairs coming. Please bear with us. The goal is there's something about Piper that just seems officious and not exactly familial. And so what we try to do, and this is something that Moisen has been doing the last couple of years, is we try to do kind of midday, conversations like this in a way that's slightly more, if not intimate, at least proximal. So thanks everyone for joining us. I guess the other thing I could say is that this is the penultimate event in the calendar for the fall that's landscape architecture specific. On Wednesday, November 28th, we're going to have the opening event for Cartographic Grounds, the amazing show just outside in the lobby that Joe DeSimone curated. And so join us that Wednesday evening, the Wednesday after Thanksgiving weekend. So please come in. There are many, many things that I could say, but I also feel in introducing Martha Schwartz, the thing to say is that she is your Martha Schwartz. She's here before I was, and at the same moment, we were just chatting a little bit offline about what should we expect kids today to know about the 1980s or 90s or the recent past. And it's a bit of an interesting question in my own mind about in this line of work, how much of our own formation biographically and pedagogically, and in terms of the shape of the field, need we bore you with, so as to then set up why it is that we're doing what we're doing now. And that's maybe a subtext that we could return to. We'll have a little bit of time for some discussion, but we're primarily here to hear from Martha and see some work. So Martha Schwartz, as you know, is a professor in practice of landscape architecture here at the GSD. She's taught here for a few years and has been a committed 20, is that right? So I learned last night that means 2 decades.
He said a few decades. I was like, oh my God, that means 3.
This may be a cultural difference. I used to split hairs on what a couple as opposed to a few was. So we could say a couple decades,
30.
Not yet a quarter century, but it is true that over the last quarter century, Martha has an extraordinary pull and influence on the field itself. She is principal and founder of Martha Schwartz Partners based out of London and has practiced with a foot on both sides of the Atlantic at various times in the last several years. She, beginning in the late 70s and early 80s, was a part of the small group, a vanguard of people in the field who were really exploring, reconnecting landscape architecture, I would say, to conceptual art practice, land art, pop art, and a range of other considerations. Please come in. We've just sat down. There's some more chairs back over here behind us.
There are more chairs.
Please. We have more coming in. Over the course of that time in the late 70s and into the 1980s, Martha and some of her fellow travelers were engaged in a response, a disciplinary and professional response to what was then perceived as the ascendancy of the empirical scientific method. And of course, we might think of that work as, on the one hand, a kind of postmodern response to the triumph of late modernism, You might also think about it, the way that I think about it often is as a response to 1968, the post-68 landscape architecture in many places here, at Harvard, certainly in other leading research universities. Landscape architecture tended to be radicalized around environment, and often that tended to push departments of landscape architecture toward models of the sciences, the empirical, positivist. That was certainly one of the strains here, and at the same moment there had been this long-standing tradition of landscape architecture as a design discipline. And in that context, of course, we might think of this work in the late 70s, early 80s as ultimately occupying a position. I don't think this was the intention of it. It came to stand as a kind of alternative to those science-based practices. And that is already unfair because it's a bit too much of a caricature. But certainly by the time I came to know this department and this school, its commitments in landscape architecture were often described to me as an outsider in terms of a kind of opposition, a kind of long-standing tectonic struggle between the empiricists or the positivists on the one hand, and those advocates of design culture on the other. And a part of what's been interesting in the last couple of years for me, kind of joining this community, is to read behind the headlines and see the actual, personal biographies and individual actors and protagonists in that story. And at the same moment, I've been very pleased that we, in the last several years, have said that struggle is over. It's precisely the wrong battle to have in this line of work for reasons that we'll talk about this afternoon. And that secondly, I would say that those relationships have been changing over the last several years anyway. And Martha, over the course of the last 2 decades at least, has been among a group of people who have been leading landscape architecture, been focusing on its role as the vanguard of urban development, the making of cities. If you have seen this piece of work called Cumberland Yorkville Park in Toronto, this is now 20 years in the ground and is, to my mind, among the finest designed landscapes in North America to date. It just recently won the ASLA Landmark Award for a project of enduring significance. And at the same moment, that project you might think of as a hinge. You could look at that and say, well, it does share some of the antecedents of that work from the late 70s and early 80s. At the same moment, it was the beginning of what I now think of as really 2 decades of Martha's commitment to making urban spaces. And that's the primary subject matter of her more recent book. You can see here the European cover, which I can tell you without betraying any confidences, I think she favors. And that I'm holding in front of you the US version of the cover. Why that is different and the details of that we can climb into in our discussion. So recycling spaces, curating urban evolution, documents work over the last 10, 12, 15 years, and it's arranged less as a monograph of work, although there is work in it. It's arranged in a collaboration with Emily Waugh as a series of conversations with people who are engaged in questions around city making, around environment, around ecology, and tries to position the role of the landscape architect and the role of Martha Schwartz Partners in recent practice as central to the making of viable and vibrant urban spaces. I've already gone on too long, but I've got a lot more I could say, but I'll save some of that for the conversation that we'll have following. So please welcome your own Martha Schwartz.
This on? Yeah, Charles, thank you. I always, it's horrible having to be a second act to Charles. But I have to say it's lovely to see you all here. I know you guys are a tough audience, so it's a little intimidating. I can say I was once in your position, but I've grown a lot more humble for all these years. But I'll try to kind of carry through as much time span as I possibly can pack into here. I hadn't really quite focused on the more historical work, because I always feel somehow burdened by that. And I mean, that's kind of this whole, why is this kind of dull and green, the other colorful, is because I feel that, I carry the baggage of my past transgressions wherever I go in the United States, which is the place where I have the least amount of work. than any place else, maybe not Africa, but around the world.
It's early.
It's early, I'm trying to get there, but so that's a whole discussion. But first of all, I want to say that the work you're going to see is really a collective, ongoing collaboration between me and the very, very talented people I have had historically in my office, and I still do. I have created kind of baby practices all over the place to successfully compete with me now, and I'm very proud of them. A lot of wonderful people have actually contributed to the work of the office. I actually believe that in order to really keep our edge, I mean, I'm an idea junkie. I love good ideas. So people can contribute from wherever they are within the office, at whatever position. And it's always the best idea and the idea that fits is the one we go forward with. So Charles has talked about the book. But what I'm just going to launch in here, and I thought, well, this is going to, in one sense, I'm busy trying to set myself straight because I really fundamentally feel misunderstood, I guess. So I'm not going to go through all of these things, but I'm going to try to get down to some of the things I hear about me, which is really frustrating. It's like, no, she doesn't like trees, and she hates nature. Using color is actually evidence of hating nature, by the way. I do pop landscapes. I have done pop landscapes, and I may do pop landscapes. But I don't do exclusively, not every landscape we do is pop, which I'm too designy, I'm too busy. I can't be found. I'm not really a landscape architect. I'm not really an artist. I'm a bitch. Because I'm a designer, that's a particularly bad position to be in, a woman designer. Because if you're a designer and you have an ego, just having an ego as a woman is a bad thing altogether. Not a good thing. This one I'm going to speak to because this makes me super crazy that I'm not contextual. We'll talk about context because context, and we talked about this last night, it's a judgment call, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, we go into places where you don't want to adapt or adopt the context because the context is negative or it's unhealthy or it's something that nobody values. Very often we have to make up a new context. Or sometimes you actually have to make a decision that some of the context is good and some of the context isn't. Or maybe it needs to be completely protected. There is no, this is what you have to do, you must be contextual. You need to figure out what needs to be done vis-a-vis the context. Anyway, very often, these are the contexts that we work in because the practice is and has been avowedly urban. I love cities, I've always loved cities. It has not been the focus of the profession for most of the profession's life. But I actually like these kinds of things because I can't do any harm to them. I can only make them better. And then because they're so underfunded and under-advocated, it actually takes more imagination. It requires imagination because you do not have the investiture of money and good materials. So a good idea, something that actually brings life to something that's that degraded is really what's required. So I think that what our part of the discussion, because of course I know sustainability is a terrible word, you know, there's got to be a better way to blah, blah, blah. Let's just call it sustainability for right now. But the role that design and our imaginations and ability to integrate ideas and transform things is very, very relevant to what we do as landscape architects, in addition to all the other things we do as landscape architects. So it's important to remember that we have a very, very strong voice and role in terms of physical transformation of places. That's why we're a design school. I did start off, I mean, my background has always been in fine arts, and when I was in the 60s, this wasn't historical. This was happening. The asphalt rundown with, you know, Smithson. These were amazing pieces of work that we hadn't seen before. They were heroic. They were in a site, reverberated to these beautiful landscapes. They weren't for sale. So I thought, well, geez, these are ultra cool pieces. This is what I want to do. So I went into landscape architecture to build big art. And at a time where in a class, I was at the University of Michigan, there must have been like 25 students. There was one other student from the arts. The others were all out with the idea of having this environmental ethos, and they were going to save nature. And I was like, well, yeah, I kind of want to save nature, but these were the bellwethers of the environmental movement, which made us see the landscape in a completely different way. There are different ways in which to actually help and support that visibility. So, okay, so I went into landscape architecture to learn how to build art, and when I got out, and my last year was at Harvard, I did go to try to learn how to be a real landscape architect, but pretty much gave up on that in about 3 months. I decided to build this temporary installation. It's called the Bagel Garden, and I will spend a little bit more time on it, just in case it is kind of gone and faded back into history. I did this as a whim. I did it as basically a joke to my, I was playing a joke on my husband. It was Peter Walker, who was my professor here when we could do things like that.
Maybe I missed the number. Is that not okay?
Was that you who ran across? Yes, but quick. So I just made this by myself. I didn't have any money, but Pete and I were arguing about what we were going to do in the front yard for about 3 years. So he was out of town for 2 weeks, and I went into action. And the rule was I could only buy whatever I could get from around the block. This is on Marlborough Street. So I went to the aquarium store, the delicatessen, blah, 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 and made this installation. And invited my good friend Alan Ward, who's my classmate here, who brought over his 4x5, and he made these gorgeous images. So he sent that in. We sent it into the Landscape Architecture magazine. Grady Clay was the the editor, and he decided to put it on the cover, and then asked me to write an article. What is this? Why are you doing this? So I wrote an article about why the bagel is the perfect landscape material, because at that time, it was a super corporate world dominated by, corporate practices. I can tell you, I mean, this is this is like 1981 or something.
79, 80.
Yeah, like there. Yeah, the SWA group, Sasaki, Pod, I mean, there are a lot of big male-dominated practices. Male-dominated because when I was at SWA, there were 120 people, not one professional female, not one. So I'm just saying, it's hard to imagine this, I know, but this is the way it was. Getting out of art school, I just decided, okay, appropriateness was a big idea, again, doing the right thing, being able to design public spaces for every man. I mean, these were things that were kind of floating around, and I decided, well, the bagel is a perfect material because it's democratic, it's cheap, anybody can do it, it does well in the shade, it's biodegradable, and I made a very good case for why it was a good landscape material, and it freaked out the profession totally. I mean, Landscape Architecture magazine, the next month there was cuts and fills, and people would write in their little commentary. You could landscape Northern Hemisphere, and you'd get 3 comments. This thing, it was a running commentary packed full of debate. People were really angry. They canceled their subscription to the magazine. Grady Clay was eventually fired. And this, this was a manifesto. We didn't have site-specific art back then in the olden days. We didn't have land art. Nobody really had called it anything. I know this is prehistory, but it's kind of why this is so upsetting. And I mean, that's probably why I don't really get a lot of work in the United States. It's probably because of this. But here's what happened is that what I was saying is that a landscape can have content. It can be funny. It can be ironic. It can have political content. I mean, there was, Back Bay, historically, it's a very waspy, kind of anti-Semitic place, and all of a sudden there are these homey bagels sitting out there. And what the hell's going on here? But why can't the landscape have cultural content? And again, this is against the backdrop of what Charles was talking about, where it was highly there was a strong environmental ethos only, and there was a right way of doing things, and there was a methodology. And I'm like, well, who says that's the only thing it can be? So that was kind of my hat into the ring, and then after that, I kept doing art installations. But I'm always afraid that that's all that, people think of me as the bagel lady, and I do little discrete kind of art interventions, and they're not, they don't have anything to do with context or with ecology or blah, blah, blah. So I decided I'll go from the bagel garden to kind of what we're doing today. And I just explain context a little bit. This is 4.5 kilometers of beach along the Abu Dhabi coast here. This is how it kind of started off. It's all man-made, big highway. They're starting to fill in, and now they've asked us to really design about 4.5 kilometers. And so from the bagel garden, we've gotten up to this kind of scale of design. And we're working with very large teams, complicated teams. With the landscape architect, we were asked to pull together a team of architects, environmental engineers, traffic consultants, financial analysts, events planners, public communication people, integration with public meetings. I mean, a huge team. And the idea was to really create almost a system of environmental protection, as it turns out, against seawater rise, being able to segregate disparate populations along this length, to be able to manage it properly so that you can kind of almost create rooms for individual management, work within a very strict kind of planting and Estidama environmental code. Working with the city to really think about how this edge can integrate with the green system so that pedestrians and bicycles can be integrated into an overall thought. How to use this island called Lulu Island in a way that might actually recapture and reinforce the water's edge in a green system. Anyway, I'm not going to explain all these things, but it's a huge amount of integration of all different kinds of information that in the end we have to resolve into a physical form. So we can't forget the physical form giving, but this physical form has to be informed by all sorts of layers and layers of information. So the idea of how people use space, I think, is something that is very, very important to us. We really care about people, how people use space and who's using it and how to really integrate that, the use patterns and desires also into the landscape. So working within groups and within consultants, we really came up with this huge list of all what needed to be kind of planned out along this 4.5 kilometer stretch. Dealing with the city engineers and the city on the issue of sea level rise, which was, they really didn't want to face that. But we used an idea of filling and also creating an upper edge to the beach that would protect the beach from the adverse kind of environment of the road, while still future protecting the rest of the city was part of this concept. Here we have the beach. We have organized all the buildings and the program underneath almost a roof garden that would enable people to participate on the beach and still be under green that then separates the road. We have bike paths and then pedestrian paths. This one is an important image. It's really how we work in the office. And it's, I believe very strongly that there is no linear methodology for figuring out what the physical end is going to look like. That you can create an aesthetic strategy almost before you know much about the site at all. Because then you can see which aesthetic strategy best fits your continuing uploading of information. And the other thing is that you can have multiple aesthetic strategies that solve problems. But in the end, if you present something that people just don't like or don't feel comfortable with, on the pure basis of aesthetics, it's not going to happen. They're going to be also death by 1,000 cuts. You will not get the support that you need to carry on projects like this. So what we like to do is, like, hands down, everybody have a group charrette, everybody works on it for a day, not very much time. We put it up against the wall. We all vote. Everybody has a vote. You know, and so then we take a look at what ideas have actually popped up. I have an office full of really smart, talented people. I want to see what they think. Of course, my vote counts for more. But what this enables us to do is kind of put the thoughts into different places so we can start to represent to our client different ideas and directions. So it turns out this is something that the client wanted with all the different kind of ideas, visual ideas we had. They wanted something that was much more kind of rectilinear, that reflected the grid of the city and reflected more urbanity. This is important. So this is kind of what this looks like. Now, it's also structured like a commercial building, and we know that commercial buildings are more able to be used adaptively. It's adaptive reuse. So these are 100-meter bays that can be used and managed. So, I mean, this goes from being, underground parking, parks, overlooks, restaurants, water taxis. We worked with architects to do this beach club, which actually created a shaded pool that needed to be cooled because it's so hot there in the summertime. You needed a cool pool. This really divided up into kind of an upper promenade and a promenade that for bikes that would take you along the road with these kind of upper gardens and tree terraces. Community center, and then the community center with play areas. It's a very young population. You have to know the demographics of your population to be able to design kind of the end of it. And this kind of shows you at a conceptual level kind of the scale of this. And, you know, it's just a concept at this point. Working with, very strict rules of sustainability. I mean, these are rules, which are good rules, and they need to be followed. So we're very careful. However, we did find out that in order to use the native plants, they were actually providing these plants. They were digging them out of the desert and thus reducing their seed stock. So this is what you, in practice, you deal with. Not everybody's coming out of the GSD and understands what the issues are. So it's your job to bring those issues. And you have to weigh the benefits and try to explain why you can't just take the seed stock out of the desert and why it will end up being as accountable in terms of sustainability because we're going to be shipping in the seed stock. But if you don't do it, if they were to actually have a higher marking for Estadama for this project, they would have emptied their deserts. So again, education and kind of bringing your talent as an educator, a thinker, a creative person to the table is really important. This is a master plan we did for Cork. I'm not going to go through all this either, but Cork is a city in Ireland that is below sea level. They were looking for a landscape master plan. I always do that. It's the rudest thing. I'm the rudest person.
I think it might be fair to say that if it's a client, you might take it.
No. No. Well, maybe. Anyway, the idea is how do you actually think about a landscape so that it really services the city? In this case, how do you keep it from going underground? Now, we work with, London is like a shopping center for consultants. It has the world's richest kind of per square footage of really great consultants. So I have learned so much working with really advanced environmental consultants and environmentalists and engineers. So we're always working hand in hand with these people and coming up with systems that we know we can deploy in the landscape. The problem is that whatever technology you really know about right now, in about 3 years, it's going to be new. So you have to know the really good people who are really up to date with all this stuff and become very good friends with them. But what we really did is we tried to design, we determined where things were going to go, how they were going to function, road systems, paving hierarchies, and materials. But the physical design was designed to be like a giant sponge. In other words, we used grading to actually capture water and direct water so that when it did flood, it would only flood the landscape and it wasn't going to flood the building. So the whole thing is designed as a big sponge. We have one side which is a very urban edge where the majority of the city kind of engages the river. And then you'll see we have these kind of channels that distribute the water and drain it back out. This is a train station, kind of a public park connection. I won't go into the specifics, but it's a crinkled landscape with the idea that we're both generating electricity, we're creating kind of a very dynamic place. So these are beautiful windmills that are we work with David Marks, who did the London Eye. He has all these great kind of designs for wind. And we're using this folding landscape and these channels to collect the water and keep it out of the city where most of the investment is. So we work a lot with integrating, suds and channels that will kind of be able to capture water out on the streets. But again, this has to really look cool. It also has to be a place where people are going to want to go and are attractive. This was kind of the major kind of sponge piece in the whole thing, which was kind of a energy generating area. So we really took in a lot of water. This is a Chicago Navy Pier competition. Actually, James Corner won this. Unfortunately, we came in second. But the problem is that this adaptive reuse of these kind of old infrastructures are being done everywhere as we're cleaning up rivers around the world. And just like most post-industrial countries and cities, everybody's trying to reorient themselves back to the water because the water is now clean. So what we did, and also this is over-commercialized, they're losing customers, and Chicago wants to put itself on the map to attract tourism. So they want something that's going to do that. At least that's what they said. So what we did is we've incorporated, we got out the kind of neoclassical turning, kind of drop off. This is a museum building, created a wetland garden, kept the footprint of the industrial pier, and then used these wooden barges and docked them against the side, creating a series of wooden barges that, offered public space and enabled people to get down to the water, boats, hot tub area like the Blue Lagoon in Reykjavik, and then a great big kind of fountain pool that stepped down into the water. So we work with Herbert Dreisidel in terms of really figuring out how to make this kind of a demonstration area where the stepping down, getting down to the water, enabled us to plant different kinds of plants that would represent the earth stepping down and layers of wetness. And then here you can see that these ramps go over to these floating barges that attach to the side of the pier. The most sustainable material here, by far, was concrete, the use of concrete. We can talk about that later, but the embodied resources used in both making and delivering this was by far the most ecologically sound strategy for materials. We attached an old existing amusement park by creating these. Now, this is all concrete here. This was wood. But the idea of creating these ramps and areas for play and playgrounds and entertainment. We worked with Ned Kahn, who's an artist who really focuses on phenomenology. This is our hot tub area and then our play pool. And in the wintertime, of course, it needs to be designed to have outdoor activities. So this was a skating rink out on the lake. A large project we're doing in Jakarta right now, again, very, very interesting. They're building islands. This is a city of 10 million people. It's very environmentally and politically challenged. It really is in bad shape. It's sinking because the water has been drained from its aquifer, so it's sinking about 10 centimeters per year. So they're building these islands, and we're working on these islands right now. But you can see that the ocean is very close to filling up and overspilling. The mangroves and native mangroves are really endangered, so are the economies that depend on it. We're working with the plan, and I would say without going into the specifics of the plan is all about recapturing water, making sure that we are not taking any water out of the aquifer, and we're recycling it, and we're using it to actually characterize the landscape as well. Again, our job, because it's a private sector project, because the government doesn't put in any infrastructure, it's up to the private sector, and your ability to convince your client that this is the right thing to do. Probably not even for environmental sake. You have to prove that economically it's going to work. I mean, that's your job, is to kind of show that. So we're integrating a whole series of water cleaning systems that will end up being things that come to characterize and attract people to come to live in the garden. So it's a big central park, which is water cleaning, and really using water circulation to and cleaning as a central feature of it. I just had a conversation with Jack Spengler right before this, and he told me that they have a bacteria now that cleans the water, and you can harvest from the bacteria biofuels. So while you're cleaning the water, you can then use that to generate energy. Amazing stuff. So this is what's so rich about our profession, is that you hear there's so much invention going on. I think we're really truly in a renaissance right now. We don't know it, but we're really able to deploy these incredible inventions that are happening and then put them into the life of a city so that you can make attractive, meaningful, fun places that people will choose to live in. So this is all about regenerating the mangroves along a breakwater that we're going to need to protect this kind of new development. Again, these are highly technical kind of interventions, but the idea is that you also have to make sure that your developer who wants to sell houses and commercial, you've designed it so that people will want to go there. And if you don't do that, then all of it fails. So that's why the design part is important. This is in Beirut. It's a waterfront park. It's a competition. Right now, things have kind of come to somewhat of a standstill in the Middle East. But it's the largest piece of open space in Beirut. And it's very interesting. Beirut has a super young population, which inherently makes it a bit unstable, especially when you don't tend to the needs of youth, especially young boys. However, they're afraid of people congregating, so they want an open space that can be closed off. I don't know, that may be right, that may be wrong, but that's what is needed. It is part of your remit. So our question is, well, how do we do that without making it feel like the green space is inside a fence? You don't want that to seem that way, but it needs to be managed. So this part of this park is open to the community and housing. This park is just a generous open green space. There's a highway, crosses over to the water's edge. In this case, we decided just kind of allowing there to be green spaces that we basically landformed a series of terraces that overlook the ocean, that overlook the ocean here, and then there's an outdoor amphitheater. There is a major pathway that takes you from the downtown underneath this archway and out, crossing the road, out to the water. Then, this is kind of the urban plaza. This is a model that really shows this idea of this upper walkway, this promenade that takes you up and around and then to the stage and amphitheater and then down and out. And then this takes you from the downtown area and out to the waterfront. Now, there's parking underneath the road, so this is kind of a moat, and the moat becomes this promenade, but it all can be managed. So it's about how you integrate the ability to kind of close this off. There are gates that are kind of designed inside this, this structure. Places for people to sit, very, very important. But the idea of the layering also comes because everything below ground, we actually the whole site is built on the rubble of Beirut. So we wanted to make that history visible. So we took the rubble and we built it in gabions, and everything above ground was in native stone. So just a big, gracious outdoor, space. There's Thomas Heatherwick's Bee of the Bang, which I would love to put there. And then the most important part, probably, is the suggestion of doing a skateboard park for the kids that are kind of underneath this kind of raised promenade, because the kids need a place to be kids. These are older projects. Mesa, Arizona is a Center for Performing Arts. I just put this in there to show you that the majority of the site is parking spaces. The majority of the city are parking spaces. Again, is this contextual? What is the context? Is this a great context? Should we put in more parking lots so we can be contextual? I mean, that's how crazy the whole idea of context makes me. So here, what really needed to happen is that we needed to create some civic open spaces, cultural arts center, places where people could actually get off sidewalks into spaces where they could be together. The idea was to invest in the cultural arts in order to get people to move into Mesa to support its economy and attract people there. So the idea is that this is this great big linear kind of plaza that enables people to perform, to sit, to hang out. It's a 3-ring circus that can be managed, and it really is a very, very popular place now to be. All sorts of kind of tricks about how we really make this work, technologically in a sustainable way. Don't use a lot of water. You don't need a lot of water to make water fun and accessible. This is the Arroyo. It's about 500 feet long. It's a ditch that fills up. It mimics the water system there, and then it drains out. And this enables us to not lose a lot of water through evaporation. And then it is the #1 place for taking wedding photos. So it has actually attracted businesses into the town. This is our landscape, everyone. Everything outside the building is a landscape. And these are often the kinds of projects I deal with, which are kind of less than optimal. So again, context. Is this the context? What is this? Where's the context here? And we're often asked to, well, solve the problem, Martha. Come up with something that's going to work. Because obviously this is really a terrible hodgepodge, and nobody cares about it. So there was an IRA bomb that went off, and they rebuilt it, determined that this would be an open space. So the narrative, and it's not important that anybody gets a narrative, but it's important for me to have one. But we always try to come up, we do a lot of research on every site, we try to find out what are those stories and the characters that could actually result in something that is interesting to see and be in. So there are always these underlying stories. But the story for here is that this whole part of the city is built on a pudding stone outcropping. It's a cathedral district. This upper area is on granite. So there is this dividing line, and we've stitched together the division with these ramps and seats. And here, nobody said, make a living room for the city. But that's actually what we did. We created these big, wide, fat, low walls that people could sit on in a variety of ways, looking this way or looking that way or lying down, inventing new ways of using spaces and inviting people to explore spaces is what's so cool about what we do. And us collectively, that's what's fun about it. The Upper Plaza is an ode to the train industry, without which Manchester would not have become the Industrial Revolution. The Lower Plaza is kind of a re-excavation of the hanging ditch, which was a water flume that ran a flour mill. And this piece is probably the most interesting and lively place in the whole thing. It's this kind of weird thing where people do. I always love to see this kind of thing. I'm like, oh my God. But people play on it, and it's a very, very heavily used, very beloved space. What they did is they put a screen on top of the corn exchange, probably not architecturally correct. However, people do get sandwiches, and they sit down and watch the soap operas. That's awesome. And then I'm always like, people are complaining because I don't have people in my images, which means that they're not successful spaces. So this is fuzzy, but you can see there are a lot of people in it. Grand House this is in Dublin. It is a brownfield. It was an industrial site. This is our site. We are often given sites where the real ground is nowhere in sight, quite literally. Maybe 40, 50, 80 feet below the level of the city is ground, or probably rock. Everything's been built. My world is like landscaping a supertanker, because the technical section of the earth is technologized. It's the city, it has everything in there. So anyway, so then you have to cope with that and all the constraints of that. And very often, just like this, I can't tell you how many projects where oh, it's a parking lot, Martha, it's a slab. And we didn't want to pay the amount of money for the steel to hold up trees. And of course there's no waffle for the roots. We don't need roots because we don't need the trees. We don't even want the trees. So it's not that I hate trees, it's just that collectively, the clients, the cities don't make rules. That's what you get when you actually don't make sure that by code, developers have to dig a deeper hole, they have to spend more money, and that they have to include ecologies in their urban landscape. So as soon as we can do that in the United States or elsewhere, I will be planting trees, I promise. So this kind of shows it built, and this is, all this development has happened around it. We were the first ones. We were asked to build a plaza before any of the other buildings were built, in order to let people know that things were happening in Dublin. And we were told we didn't have to actually work with any of the architects, which we didn't actually. However, we did know that this was the performing arts building that was being designed by Daniel Libeskind. So in behalf of making a context, we made the context by Libeskining the plaza. We just said, okay, this needs a context. So we're going to create a context. So that's what we did. And there's nothing of weight on it because there can't be any weight on it. We rolled out the red carpet. There is a forest of red poles. The client said we need something of color because Dublin is gray. And then we planted, we had about a foot of earth that we could use, so we kind of replanted kind of the natives that would have grown along that edge. And it's a big party place. So now when you get to Dublin, everybody knows the place of the red poles. The good story about this is that even though the economy is doing very poorly, everything around this square is doing very well. The hotels, the restaurants, the offices, it's still humming. So the landscape can actually help a place in a city to function because people want to be there. You've created a desire to be there. So this one is the Abu Dhabi Financial Center. I'm not going to comment too much about the architecture, but we decided in this case to do absolutely the opposite. Like, okay, here's the context. Anybody want to be contextual here? Okay, so we were contextual. We actually decided to go 180 degrees and feminize it. To really do something that looked like your grandmother's doily. But the other problem is that, yes, this is on top of a shopping center. No, it can't really hold trees. No, there's no waffle for a root ball, so that whatever landscape you put on has to be raised, which is really brutal. So, and this is just happening recently, it's being built. So we tend not to ever learn those lessons, and still, if you want to be a practitioner, you have to deal. These are green wall technologies that have been folded into origami. So they're very thin sections, they don't have a lot of soil, they use a very little amount of water, and they're panels that have been constructed into these shapes. So even though it kind of looks like your grandmother's doily from above, there is a connection to the angularity of the architecture. There is a reference to that. And they still make spaces. These are these benches, which we're just installing now, but they have a tiny trickle of water in here that recirculates. So when you're sitting on here, you can play in the water as well. So these are kind of turning out to be very nice. It still hasn't opened. Okay, we're getting to the end here. We do art installations. I am looking to do more art. I love doing art. I will never give that up because it allows us to practice and to try things. Temporary art is wonderful. There really is a power to make change. Again, if the Bagel Garden could actually make a change within the profession of landscape architecture, it's not about size. It's about the quality of thought. It's about kind of bringing something new into the world. So the topic of this, let me just go back, this is a protest against the smelting of aluminum ore, which is really screwing up the Icelandic landscape. They can do it very cheaply because they have geothermal heat. And immigrants are coming in, and it's a very serious impact. So the idea is to build a geode. This is a geode. This is a Museum of Contemporary Art there. And the outside of the geode is really tough, rough, blank, black. Inside the geode is this kind of crystalline center. The idea is that from the museum you can access and walk around the outside, well, interior, but you walk around inside, but you can't get into the middle. You can only see into the middle. This is Dan Gass, who is, he and my son, helped us to construct this thing, which was crazy. We used industrial-grade aluminum and then created these portals that allowed you to see only certain portions of the interior. And so this is kind of what it looked like when you were in the interior. You can only see certain amounts. You could never behold the whole thing. And it was, I mean, it was seriously blinding. So, I mean, I would say that the parable here is everything that glitters is not gold. And you know, you would go in, it was dark, your eyes would, would dilate, and then you would look into the middle of this thing. It was like this cauldron of light, and it hurt. But again, you know, we're human. We couldn't help but go and force ourselves. We wanted to look in there too. At the same time, it hurt us. So, you know, people were compelled to look into these cauldrons of burning light. They were also very beautiful. And people really did respond. They thought it reminded them quite a lot of the landscape in Iceland, because it is very volcanic. It's very harsh. It's very beautiful. Nature Pixels. So this is an art installation that we did we proposed for Australia, working on a building by Rochester Harbour, where we were, Sydney. Their building has an undercroft about 5 stories, so we wanted to occupy this volume. It's outdoors, and the biggest issue here was that there was a rip-roaring wind coming into the space. So we studied the wind, and we decided I wanted to do something that was kind of wind generated, that was responsive to the wind. So I was working over Christmas, and I made this model out of flour and water and kind of shish kebab sticks. To begin with, like, well, what if we had fans that rotated? And then we worked with a guy named Neil Thomas from Atelier 1, who is a genius rock and roll structural engineer guy who is seriously a genius and so much fun to work with. He does a lot of stage set designs. So we designed these fans, and we got these beautiful color-coded dichroic paints. And we started modeling them up on the shish kebab sticks going horizontal here, and then these things would rotate in the space. So that was kind of one generated model. Then we thought, well, what happens if we turn them so that they're vertical? I thought, oh my God, that's so much better. So these things are kind of vertical, twirling fans that are going to take up the volume of the space. I have an animation, I'm not going to show it, but this is kind of the effect of the space. And the idea is that depending on where the wind is flowing, that's where you would actually detect the movement. Our last one, Xi'an, this is at the Horticultural Exhibition of 2011, where they invited about 6 or 8 master gardeners. Our big idea here was to use materials that are used by the craftspeople in Xi'an. So if you want to be specific to an area, you find out what people build and out of what materials. And that really helps quite a bit to creating kind of a sense of place. Like, just do what they're doing there. So I tend to be very conservative in terms of materials, but not conservative in terms of their expression. But the history, of course, are these loess fields that people carve their homes, and these beautiful gateways and arches of stone. Initial sketches about, well, what happens if you're kind of in a space made out of earth with the landscape on top. We were each given a square to occupy, which is about 30 meters by 30 meters, and ours was like a fun house. It was like a traditional, almost maze garden. The maze was made up of a series of walls that had openings that led to these hallways, but none of the hallways were straight. And you can't see, the roof is it's willows, but you can't see any of the trunks of the trees. So these are elevations we did of the brick walls. At the end of the hallways are panels of mirrors, so that these things are kind of cattywampus and you can't quite see where they end. And this is the very friendly urban edge and entrance into our box. They gave us the topic was the harmonious coexistence between city and nature. So that's what the title of this is. So actually when we showed up there, they thought it was so urban. We had a whole line of garbage cans along here. So I thought, well, this looks city. Now let's dump our garbage cans along here. So I should have left them. I made them take away. So you go in, and then all of a sudden, everything starts to become mirrored and a little strange. And then all of a sudden, honestly, people looking at themselves was hilarious. People love to look at themselves and photograph themselves. And then you have endless choices where to go, which actually, you know, the Chinese culture is not that comfortable dealing with endless opportunities in terms of where to go. I mean, honestly, I mean, like, it's kind of high anxiety. It would be for anybody, but exactly which door to take and what's the right way, or what happens if you make a wrong turn, or...
We will be taking questions.
Yeah, we'll take, yeah. But, I mean, yeah, some people just turned away and said, oh, well, screw it, you know, this is, I can't cope with this. But anyway, so for the brave folks who did go through, you kind of wandered through and you could make all these choices. And this guy was funny, following me and photographing me, and then I started following. And you get wedged into these corners, and then most of them ended up in these dead ends and mirrored rooms. So you'd have to kind of backtrack and try to figure out which door to take. And then, yeah, we had about 1,000 bells that we strung in there to make it a little bit more tense. And people taking pictures of themselves. Finally, you get to the end, and you are now looking into a space. Do you guys know who Josiah McElhenney is? He does these beautiful artworks of objects, mirrored objects that are endlessly mirrored in endless spaces. So this is kind of the Josiah McElhenney endless willow grove. So you look in there and the willows now go on forever. So you get to hang out there for a while. It's a little spooky. And then, oops, what did I do? Sorry. How do I... Can somebody get up? I don't want to go through. If you can go backwards or just go into the slide sorter and get me to the very end. We're almost there. Or is that the last slide? Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, is that the last slide? Oh, darn, I guess I eliminated... no, I guess not. So I cut off the best part. But the end of this whole thing is that when you exited the hallways, you understood that all those mirrors were one-way mirrors, and you were being watched the whole time. And this was also disturbing, but we saw people adjusting their underwear, kissing, you know, doing really strange things because they didn't know they were being watched, and the people in the hallways were just rip-roaring with laughter and taking pictures of people who had no idea they were being photographed. So, you know, kind of the subtext of it was Big Brother, but we didn't advertise that perspective. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you. The big, no, I mean, a lot of this stuff. No, most of the stuff isn't in the book. Most of the stuff isn't really in any book. I have another book that's left of this.
So thank you. Thanks very much for that. While people are readjusting to the room, please, you know, feel free to move around, get comfortable, do what you need to do. We do have a little bit of time for a conversation and also your questions, and I will be committed to getting you out of here just before your 2 o'clock commitments. For me, the place to start is maybe self-evident, but I'm always interested because I wasn't smart enough to go into landscape architecture to ask, how did you find the field? Like, we'll climb back into some of the threads that are in the work and some of the things that you've talked about and things that are in the book, but I'm really interested to know how it is, like when was it and how it was that you came to know that this was a field that existed, and at what point did it become clear for you that that might be something you wanted to do?
I don't know whether I'm allowed to tell that story.
I see.
Situation.
Moving right along.
It had to do with, I was in art school, but I've always been interested in biology. I was a double major in pre-med and art, and I was in pre-med just because I really enjoyed the subject. And I went up to University of Michigan's, because it's called Bug Station, which is in Pelston. It's where all the biologists and zoologists and botanists go up there, and they're out there for a summer doing transects and studying the bioecology of terrestrial vertebrates, meaning spiders, and I mean, it was a very science-oriented summer. I went up there. They didn't know how to register me because I was from the art school. But I met this incredible guy named Bob Zahner, and Bob was a soil scientist at the University of Michigan, probably the most fascinating subject I ever taught, because Bob was fascinating. I mean, now I think he hunts boars in South Carolina, but he started off as an architect. I really related to this guy. He was fascinating. In those days, I mean, this is like in, early 70s, I would say there was a really kind of marijuana-filled night of looking at French gardens in his library. Jesus, these are incredible landscapes. I didn't know landscapes could actually be like that, because being the daughter of an architect, the last thing I want to do is foundation planning. That wasn't going to be for me. And I was moved by how compelling and large and encompassing these landscapes were. And I thought, wow, well maybe there's something there. So yeah, that's where I thought, well maybe that could be interesting. But yeah, it was kind of this crazy guy, architect, soil scientist, now boar hunter, at the Michigan's biological station blood camp. And that's how that happened.
So maybe we should think of your
well, that's a long time ago.
Your interest in the science and your interest in the herbal is actually right up there with your interest in the arts, right? They've been toying with each other for some time. So that's it. I'm sorry to bore you all with that digression.
Well, wait a minute. No, I have to say something. In my defense, when I was here at the GSD, we were all smoking pot up on the top floor with the faculty. I'm sorry. That's true. I know this is not good.
You came
for all of you. Very bad. So anyway, that's all ancient history. We're over that now.
So I will, given the pressures of time, I will resist my temptation to dive further into your biography. That's fine. In light of those experiences, part of what you do in your work here in the faculty, a part of what we do collectively in the faculty is think about, well, what the hell should we be teaching these guys? I mean, I can tell you from my own experience. Essentially everything that I learned that was meant to make me relevant and employable, and particularly everything on the technical side was not only obsolete in 3 to 5 years, it was wrong. From where to put the insulation in the wall, through how to think about software, through how to think. Not only was it not keeping up, but it really gave me a profound hangover because it was giving me the wrong paradigm. And so I came from that and from my experience teaching here and elsewhere to the position that, well, we should really focus on what's going to be durable. I mean, I have no idea what our candidates are going to be working on in 25 years. I mean, we have no idea. And every time in our field, when we've tried, or in the design fields broadly, to estimate what that might be, I think we historically have gotten it quite wrong. And so my question is, from that point of view, what's your philosophy, what's your thinking about what we should be teaching, for lack of a better word, kids today?
Well, you're really right. I mean, it's hard to know what's going to happen, next year, much less in 20 years. I certainly could never have predicted where we are, 20 years ago, or myself, what I would be doing. So, I mean, one thing that's core is your core, and who you are, as a person, and your fundamental interests. That has to fuel you all of your life. So, I think that's kind of, in part, what you're here to do, is to really discover that. Because if you are interested in the environment, it's still so broad a topic, and it's not getting narrower, it's getting wider. So, and there's so much that needs to be done. I mean, personally, I'm freaked out. We are in a crisis mode. So we need as many good minds applying themselves to it as we can possibly find. So if you're going to be a politician, if you're going to be a lawyer, if you're going to be a designer, if you're going to be an engineer, if you're going to be a strategist, a teacher, all of these things are relevant. They're relevant. But you can only really make a contribution if you believe in what you're doing and you're really interested in it and you're willing to really devote your life to it. You know, and it better be interesting to you. I think what we have going for us is that we are so all over the place. You need to sort things out. You know, you need to take all this information, you need to evaluate it, you need to layer it, you need to actually even bring your values to it. What did I hear today? Well, I've heard this that, you know, a politician, Republican person, I forget what, but, you know, that's it, that was their own values, but how they actually, their political stance is different than that. I'm like, well, how can that be? How can your political stance be different than your values? Well, we want to know what your values are, and then you go into politics. But, you know, that's the important thing, and I think that we integrate things, we learn how to strategize, we are inclusive, we gather, you know, we appreciate the contribution of information that then needs to be sorted through, and communication. But, for God's sakes, design, physical design, do not give that up. Do not make that a secondary kind of dusty corner, because somebody's got to design this stuff. You know, we live in a physically determined world. So if we're going to give up the design and the determination of the form, or the form that actually comes out of process, whatever your particular form driver is, then it's going to happen anyway. So it's really important for us to kind of understand and be, you know, and articulate our values as designers. We're not specialists. We're integrative or creative. And I mean, I think that's really important. And if we don't really focus on our value as designers, then we're going to lose ground. And I think it's important to state the case how important it is.
That's what it's well put. It's certainly a set of values that have been, you know, embodied in the design school in the department for some time. But again, from my perspective as a relative outsider to the discipline, when I stumbled into landscape architecture, I was shocked at how there wasn't consensus around the idea that design was the most important framework for our work. And at the same moment, it brings up a set of questions. So, turning to, you know, talk a little bit more about your practice, I'm interested in two parts of what you're just describing. On the one hand, you've mentioned very clearly the importance of connecting to technical expertise across a range of subdisciplines, and that, you know, London happens to be particularly well suited for that. And at the same moment, a part of the work of the landscape architect today is to work as a synthesizer through design, vis-a-vis a whole range, an innumerable spectrum. How do you make decisions about which core competencies you want to build in your staff, in your office, in your partnership, as opposed to those that you consult with through people that have their own consultancies?
Well, this is really going to sound terribly retro, but I need people who have proficiency in the fundamentals of manipulating the landscape. You've got to know the grade, otherwise you're of no use in my office. Because shaping the land is one of the most fundamental things we have. It's a cheap tool that you can get the most amount of bang for your buck. I mean, and drain water and everything. It's the ground plane. So grading, understanding, have a general idea of all the systems that are embodied. You know, to be educated, coming from a fancy school like this, is valuable. Having the awareness. You're not going to have all the technologies and deep knowledge, but you know that these things have to be tended to. Being able to, I like people who can draw with their hands, because I find that getting into concepts through the computer enables you to go very deep, very far, but laterally thinking, like just trying something different, is done so much more quickly using your hands. Because we don't value fancy illustrations within the office. You want ideas. That's what you want. And those people who can generate ideas kind of quickly are super valuable, because then we can talk about the ideas and decide whether we're going to go through it.
It's interesting how the pressures, as you look at the increasing list of consultancies that landscape architects engage and subcontract to, I think it's absolutely true what you're saying, that it puts pressure in both directions, that as we both have to become more skilled and more fluent in a range of digital media in an ongoing way, and at the same, to really deeply collaborate with especially engineers and architects and urbanists, but at the same moment, we need another level of communication that is often really, in fact, precluded by being too digital, too early.
Yeah. I mean, we really force people to, well, we have to, because I don't have the time economically to have somebody kind of explore one idea in depth with all the parametric possibilities. However, people who actually can design through parametricism really design, because they know about form, color, texture, rhythm. I mean, those people are very, very valuable. So, yeah, it's all valuable, but the ability to articulate physical ideas and integrate this information is really super important.
That's certainly central to the conversation we're having in the department now about the shape of the ground, its manipulation, its performance, and the relationship between performativity and its cultural forms is something that we're engaged in very deeply just now. So for the last one, as you queue up your questions, those of you that have questions, I think we want to hear from you. I was struck by the Beirut project. I haven't seen that before. And a part of what it triggered for me was a little bit what I was thinking about when I was writing my modest little contribution to the book, which was puzzling over, I mean, your work and your practice have been at the vanguard of the reassertion of landscape architects over the urban territory. And at the same moment, you can see in work like Beirut or other projects in the book, an interesting thickening that we might think of as a kind of thickening and layering of practice. That in a project like that, you can see the focus on manipulation of ground plane, grading, the shape of the land as the cultural expression, combined with its performance. And that's interesting for me. It resonates for me with something that I saw Catherine Gustafson present last year in our series, where she said, essentially, I didn't have the courage to deal with plant material until fairly recently, but now I know. And if I think of that, I think of some recent work that I've seen from some other leading landscape architects, there's an interesting kind of thickening going on where we seem to have gotten past some of the easy opposition between, that guy does landform, or she does just plant material, or she does, performance diagrams and never delivers. I think these caricatures were easier to make a few years ago. Does that resonate with you at all?
I agree, but you know what? We've gotten better as a profession. Yeah. A lot better. I mean, there are a lot of really good people out there now. I mean, this is so different than it was 30 years ago, I can't tell you.
And even 10 years ago, my sense is that there's a cohort, and it's maybe small, and you guys maybe refer to collectively as celebrities, and we can talk about whether or not that's fair or true. But I do think that collectively what we know as a discipline has benefited from each of you in different ways, and in a way is thicker and more robust than it was, in my view, 10 years ago. You've heard enough from me, certainly, so I'm assuming you guys may have questions for
everything clear?
Or not.
Easy peasy? Oh.
Down front.
Sorry. I was really interested in this crazy folded landscape that you did, and the one that was supposed to act like a sponge. I think that was Dublin. And I was wondering, you talked about the importance of hand drawing, and you can quickly communicate different concepts to people, and you can test ideas. But how do you start when you're working with so many different levels of hydrology, of landform, of general form? How do you test those ideas? So how did you test the hydrology in that model?
Well, we didn't. I mean, again, this is kind of working in the real world. This is a competition, actually, that they didn't go forward with anything. So you come bearing concepts, and you come bearing, ways to attack a problem. But the difference between coming up with something that you saw in court and really working it out is, a year's work. And, you know, again, testing that and working with the environmental engineers and making sure the soils, everything is so, you know, is so important that you get it right. I mean, very often, you know, you tell the engineers, like, this is what I'm thinking, but you need to inform me of the various possible systems that we have. And then you have to make sure that the city can pay for it, or are there, you know, alternatives that are less expensive or more expensive. Then you take that back and you reincorporate it. And sometimes you find out that your strategy didn't work at all. You know, it's, you know, because you're kind of working in real time, but it's also what makes it really interesting.
I just want to, in response to that, amplify something Martha said earlier, which resonated with me very powerfully. I think we still have a bit of a kind of modernist hangover in much of the field, in that we often hear people or see critics expect that the form will emerge from those processes or from that engineering. And that's really a very modernist, very, you know, this is not what you intended with your question, but it's a very kind of moralizing way of thinking that's still deeply embedded in certain aspects of the field. The other aspect of the field that I think is equally problematic is something I've referred to as a kind of geological determinism, which also comes from a kind of modernist moral position that the expression of culture, of landscape architecture, it should express geological conditions. But what Martha said earlier, I thought was very powerful. She said, you know, having a spatial idea, having a cultural framework is a priori. We have to have that. And it's not necessarily the case that that formwork has to come out of the performance criteria itself. It may need to allow for performance, storage of water in court, but we shouldn't always wait until we have all the evidence to imagine that the form will emerge from that evidence. Is that
I am so pleased that you said that, Charles.
You said it.
Oh, did I say it? Yeah, I mean, did I say that well? It's brilliant. I wish I said that. But, yeah, I mean, I know that almost as a default position, or maybe because it's seen as a I think, kind of an easy platform, the idea that we are teaching students that a landscape must express the process of the landscape. So, well, who said that? I mean, is there a book, some Bible? I mean, who said that? It doesn't have to. It could be anything. I mean, it has to function performatively.
That's right.
Absolutely, that's our ethic.
Okay. I mean, that's one of the conversations just now in the department I hope you guys have picked up on, is this idea that, you know, when Chris Reed describes it, he says, you know, the fish in the lower Don don't care what it looks like, right? And you can isolate and describe performative criteria apart from its cultural expression.
Absolutely.
So, right.
Hi, Martha. One thing, you obviously work with architects all along here.
Oh my God, yes.
And architects, of course, always think that, you know, they can do the general forms and the landscape person is going to pick the trees. Do you find this a problem? You certainly must. And how do you address it? I mean, there must be some architect you can hardly work with.
This is, yes, I mean, all of the above. But I know my dad's an architect. So all my family's an architect. No issues there. I mean, he agrees with you 100%, actually. But first of all, when I went into landscape architecture, I wasn't really looking to be accepted by architects. That wasn't my agenda. I wanted to do my own thing. But of course, that's why I have a very small firm. But times are changing a lot, and I work with really good architects. I mean, I work with Big, the RDV, SOM, I work with Liebskin's office, I work with Adrian Smith, I work with KPF, I work with Rogers' office. I mean, there are so many people I work with who are fantastic and really appreciate bringing ideas to the table, because it just makes the project bigger. There are, Thomas Heatherwick, I mean, there are really wonderful architects that I get to work with. But the architects who really don't want people contributing any ideas, physical ideas, they don't call me up. By now, they don't call me up. Yeah, but you know what? You do have to make your bed. Absolutely. Let me just say one thing. I find that frustrating because right now the world is so complicated. I believe that the field of architecture has marginalized themselves through that kind of almost isolation. You know, there's so much to know now. You really do need to be able to share information and ideas. Yeah. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you. Yes, sorry. Hi.
You showed us the images of your design charrette process, and you mentioned the importance of hand drawing in the initial idea phase. But I'm wondering, to what extent is sort of the analog process a part of the daily practice of your firm? Is there maybe initial use of clay or these other materials outside of drawing?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. It is a very fundamental part of our office. Absolutely. We don't have a paperless office. Frankly, I couldn't work upstairs. We hang up things, we post things up on walls, we have to have visual references, we make cardboard models, clay models, we make digital models, but the generation of ideas comes much more quickly when people draw. They don't have to be good drawers, they just have to articulate an idea. So when we start digging in, and we don't want to have to repeat everything, we start building up layers of exploration, and we do use a computer. So people have to be versatile. It's not one or the other.
Is the initial process always in plan, or is it in section as well?
It's both. You have to have sectional conceptual ideas. I tend to work from plan because my background is in printmaking.
Oh.
That's my background. So I make sense. I think about it that way, and then I flip into 3D. But and section. So it's native.
Hi.
Hi.
I know that the phrase public domain is something we've spoken about a lot.
Yes.
From the 60s and 70s, when we became very conscious of these, because people became loosened up and they went out to the streets, as they began to carry out protests and statements about how they wish life was. And we bring it all the way up, metaphorically, to the spring that we see in the Arab world, in the Muslim world. That is there an issue that we moved from roughly 3 billion people to now 7 billion people, and all these little pixels of people wish to be heard. And life is changing. So the public domain becomes a place in which there's a very serious, important, moral, ethical place for design. And actually it is something which I wonder how well prepared we are to deal with this. And I wonder if you address this topic a bit more, because I think this may be one of the most important environmental places that we have to develop real tools and concepts about how to deal with it.
Nader, you're absolutely right. And now I'm really frustrated because I should have given the talk that I gave last night. But yeah, because that really is so important, that the urban landscape is the vehicle by which populations acculturate and learn to live with one another. It's a cultural form now. And I absolutely agree. The Arab Spring and those public spaces allowed people to come together in a neutral way, in a neutral territory, and have discussions. So the urban landscape has to function, sociologically, culturally, economically, as well as environmentally. But perhaps even more so, economically, socially, culturally. My thing is that the environmental issues, if it's taken seriously and on a systemic way, have to be through codes and planning. It's really tough to do it site by site. People come to you as a landscape architect, it's site by site. But if we really could solve the bigger environmental issues so that they were really systems, then the spaces we design have to actually support human life, human values. It is where we come together as a group. And this is one thing that I warn about the United States, is that we've lost our civicness, the desire to actually come together and be together. And open spaces the only place where that happens. It doesn't happen in your living room. It just doesn't. So these become extremely important organs within a city. We don't really talk about it that much in terms of how spaces, respond to social, cultural, economic issues, because we still are very embedded in the environment. But we could expand that. We should expand that. That sensitivity. And politically, if you don't understand the political system and the politics, you will never get anything built, and you won't be able to do something that's responsive to it. That's why Beirut was a very different situation than an open space in China, which is a very different situation than in Jakarta, which is very, very different than here in Boston. But really focusing on people and making places that people want to be together and making cities that people want to live in. Well, actually, that's the long way around to the short way home, where if we want to make a sustainable future environmentally, we have to collectivize. We have to make better cities for people. And the landscape can serve that, if we take what you're saying into account.
I can't imagine a better paragraph to end on. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.